A German politician and security expert recently said in an interview that in the face of mysterious drone sightings in several European countries, including Germany itself, the government should probably declare a state of tension. So now might be a good idea to explain briefly exactly what that means. First though, I'd just like to reassure everyone that this is just one politician's opinion. As of the making of this video, the government itself hasn't made any moves in that direction. The ability to declare a state of tension is one of the German government's emergency powers, and this is politically a very difficult area. After the Second World War, Germany was very reluctant to have any kind of emergency legislation at all because the Nazis had previously abused emergency decrees to eliminate opposition and to deny people many of their basic rights. It wasn't until 1968 that the Federal Republic got any kind of emergency laws at all. Such laws might be needed if a government has to react quickly and decisively to a situation where many lives are at risk, whether it's a natural catastrophe or a state of war. The problem is that this might mean bypassing certain safeguards intended to preserve the democratic rule of law. So the challenge is to find a way to make these laws available when needed, but only when needed. And that's what it means when, for example, a country declares a state of emergency. If there's been, for example, a massive earthquake, declaring a state of emergency might allow a government to use the military to distribute humanitarian aid or even help the police with law and order. Germany doesn't have one single state of emergency, but several depending on what the emergency actually is. Here we're dealing with the threat of military conflict, and there are two emergency states that the government can use. A state of tension is the one that's being talked about at the moment. It can be declared if relations with a foreign country have degenerated to the point that an armed conflict is likely. For fans of Star Trek, you can imagine this as a kind of national yellow alert. A state of tension needs a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag to be declared, and this is to ensure that there is a broad consensus for it. And what it basically does is it unlocks a series of laws that exist but can't normally be used, mostly aimed at protecting the civilian population and preparing the country for a possible invasion. For example, the government can order companies to prioritize the production of essential goods, things like food, medicine, and energy, and to maintain supplies of those things. The use of the transport infrastructure can be restricted in order to prioritize the distribution of emergency aid. People can be ordered to work in critical industries, things like that. More controversially, the armed forces can be deployed on German soil to protect critical infrastructure. Reservists can be called up, and if things get really bad, compulsory military service can be introduced. It's important to remember, though, that these things are heavily regulated by law. Even under a state of tension, the government can't simply activate these laws whenever it feels like it. It has to actually show that they are necessary. At least, that's the theory. A state of tension has never before in the entire history of the Federal Republic been declared, and so there's no way of knowing whether the safeguards that there are will in fact work. The red alert, by the way, is a state of defense, which can be declared if an invasion is in progress or is very obviously imminent. Think, for example, 70,000 troops lined up on the Polish border with their guns pointing towards Berlin. Like a state of tension, it needs a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, and it gives the government even more additional powers. First, command of the armed forces is transferred from the defense minister to the chancellor. And the process for passing laws is simplified, allowing the government to react faster when it needs to, but at the cost of bypassing a few democratic safeguards. Also, the Bundestag can legislate in certain areas that would normally be delegated to the states, although this requires the approval of the Bundesrat. On the other hand, if the federal government is somehow compromised, the states can make certain decisions that normally the federal government would have to make. And finally, elections can be postponed until after the emergency has ended. And of course, while it's difficult to declare a state of tension or a state of defense, both of these states can be ended relatively easily if more than 50% of the Bundestag votes to end it. And they must be ended as soon as the threat to Germany has passed. Again, that is the theory. We can only hope that we never have to put that theory to the test. As I said, the call to declare a state of tension is at the moment just the opinion of a single politician, Roderich Kiesewetter. Does he have a point? Well, as you might have seen in the news recently, there have been several sightings of what appear to be reconnaissance drones apparently originating from Russia. And some of these sightings even forced a couple of Danish airports to close temporarily, and not because of any direct military threat, but simply because nobody wants to find out the hard way exactly what happens when a device containing a lithium battery is sucked into an aircraft engine. To my knowledge, nothing has been confirmed, but the suspicion is that these come from Russia. Kiesewetter is of the opinion that the goals of the Kremlin are to gather intelligence, to prepare for an attack, and to spread panic among the general population. In other words, he feels that Russia is actually preparing to invade the EU, possibly Germany itself. And if that's the case, then that definitely meets the definition of a state of tension. In particular, he says that it would allow the armed forces to deal with drones when they threaten the country's infrastructure. At the moment, the forces can only act if drones threaten military installations, leaving the police to deal with the problem everywhere else, which they're not really equipped to do. But while these are legitimate concerns, there are also reasons such a step might be resisted. Any kind of emergency legislation always comes at the cost of interfering in basic democratic rights and freedoms. Let me give you an example. In recent weeks, there have been a few attacks on the railways and the electricity grid, apparently the work of domestic radical left-wing activists. Now, it is not at all clear whether or not they're getting their orders from the Kremlin. They might be, but they're probably not. But if, under a state of tension, the government passes a law allowing the army to protect critical infrastructure like the railways and the grid, you arrive at a situation where the armed forces are being deployed on home soil to deal with domestic terrorism. Something that starts to look a lot like martial law. The point has also been made that Putin is just trying to provoke NATO countries, and so the best thing to do would be to avoid rising to the bait. This could, after all, be just a bluff. I mean, he has in the past promised to nuke us, and so far, that hasn't happened. If it is a bluff, then we can probably deal with it without any kind of emergency legislation at all. Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt would like to simply amend the civil aviation security law to allow the army to provide administrative assistance to the police in dealing with the drones. Bavarian Minister-President Markus Söder thinks that it's not necessary to get the army involved at all. Simply give the police the right to shoot drones out of the sky. I'm not sure how easy it is to shoot down a drone with a police revolver, but Söder is also talking about setting up a drone center to design and develop drones capable of shooting down enemy drones, which to me feels like a Pandora's box. In any case, the decision whether or not to actually declare a state of tension comes down to this. Do you believe that Russia has not just the intent, but also the resources to actually invade Germany? If that's not the case, then it might be wise to keep a cool head. But if it is the case, then it might be a good idea to prepare for it. I don't know what the right thing to do is here, but my instinct is that an attack is actually very unlikely. Now, I made this video just to explain something that's being talked about in the news at the moment, but personally, I think that the Kremlin is just trying to scare us. And so, for now at least, I'm all for not giving them that satisfaction. Reluctant to have any emergency legislation at all because the Nazis had previously abused emergency decrees is the word I'm looking for.